Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Nocturnity. Tonight we have some When I Was Younger horror stories for you, brought to you as always by cardanapparel.com and guaranteed to have you scanning your surroundings for reassurance. If you haven't subscribed yet, take the 2 seconds it will take to do so now. Remember to like, share, and comment as well. Now, let's waste no more time and delve back into the realm of eternal night. There were some woods across from the housing co-op I grew up in. My friends and I used to play in there, even though none of our parents allowed it. We grew up in a pretty dangerous area when it comes right down to it. Those woods now, 30 years later, are apartment buildings, but back then they were a great place to play hide and seek in or catch bullfrogs or tadpoles. One day me and a few other kids from the co-op were inside those woods when we found a black leather briefcase. We brought it back across the street with us to the co-op and plunked it down on the small grass field beside the first house inside the gate. Inside were a bunch of flyers for hair care products, notepads, agendas, business cards, and the like. But before we could start playing with any of it, one of the parents of one of the friends that was there came walking over. He asked where we got the briefcase, and we had to admit that we'd been in the woods across the street. He looked over at them with a little concern and told us to stay put. He then left the co-op, crossed the street, and disappeared into the trees. A few seconds later, he came out in a huff and yelled at us not to move as he ran into his house. By the time he came back out, police cars were at the entrance of the woods. That dad came over to us and grabbed the briefcase and ran it across the street to the police officers. Then an ambulance arrived. By then, a bunch of other kids were outside with us, standing with our feet on the frame of the fence to peek over the top. Parents were gathering at the gate watching along with us. Finally, a cot came out of the woods being carried by 2 officers and 2 paramedics. On top was a man in a black suit. His face looked like it had been painted red. In hindsight, I guess it was covered in blood. They transferred his body to a stretcher and covered it with a blanket before loading it into the ambulance. I never found out exactly what happened to the man, but I'm sure he was dead. There was a bar a couple blocks away known for violence. Maybe he got in an altercation there and that led to him being beaten to death and that's where they dumped him. It's just speculation, I don't know, but I'll always remember what he looked like on that cot they had him on. Well, it sadly wouldn't be my last. It was the first dead body that I've ever seen. Minutes earlier, we were going through his briefcase. Lucky that we found it, actually. Had we passed it by, we wouldn't have gone back right away, and might have stumbled upon the body ourselves. When I was a kid in Richmond, riding bikes was a daily way of life. Granted, the only place that you had to go was school, but other than that, the point was just to ride. Me and my friends would head out of our cul-de-sac on a Saturday morning and head to parts unknown. Richmond's a big city, so there was a lot to discover. One such ride, we were heading down Blundell Street when we came upon an abandoned house with a great big yard to tear around in. The lawn was about waist high, but there were beaten footpaths that we ended up riding up and down on. It's not like it was an irresistible spot to ride. That's just how bike rides worked. The person in front would see something and yell, "Come on," and the rest would follow. However, in this case, on that day, it just so happened that one of us caught the basement door of the house a crack open. After being pointed out, we all stopped and took a look. Inevitably, one of my friends suggested that we go inside. The obvious, "No way, what if someone's in there?" followed. And that was inevitably followed by taunts of being a chicken, which of course led to the stupid decision to go inside and prove you were brave enough to do so. So, we dropped our bikes and walked down the 4 or 5 steps to the door and pushed it open. No one dared enter just yet, we just looked inside. The place looked rough. It was pretty dark since the windows were mostly boarded up, but with the light that was getting in, it was apparent that there was spray paint on the walls. After hearing no movement inside, we swallowed our nerves and slowly went in, cautiously moving through the darkness until we found a staircase to the main floor. This staircase led us to a broke-down kitchen, still equipped with a table from the last residents to live there, and trash all over it. The fridge was laying on its side, wide open. The place smelled horrible. We followed a bit of light coming from the door at the end of the kitchen and came out into the living room, where a few windows were exposed and some sunbeams were peeking inside, exposing a cloud of active dust in the air. Man, was this room creeped out. There were pentagrams on the walls, goat heads painted on top of human bodies, 666s, the works. A few older chairs were here and there, and the walls were lined with candles, hundreds of them. In the middle of the room there were more. These ones were arranged in a perfect circle, which had what looked like thick bloodstains inside of it splattered on the carpet. None of us said a word while we were in there. We just looked around, dumbstruck. We didn't know what any of it meant, but we knew it wasn't right. Finally, one of my friends yelled the F word, and we all booked it back downstairs and out the back door to our bikes. When we were far enough away, we all started laughing. But inside, we were all still pretty freaked out. Well, at least I know I was. I told my older sister what we had seen, and she told me never to go back there again, that those were satanic symbols. This, of course, made it back to my friends, and plans were made right away to spy on the place. For several weekends in a row, we would ride by it like 50 times a day. Finally, one Sunday night, when it was just a few of us, we saw a black van parked out in front of it. We ditched our bikes at the end of the block and decided to go on foot to get a closer look. The sun was just going down, so we knew soon enough we would be under the cover of darkness. About halfway from our bikes to that house, about 4 doors down, a car passed us and pulled into the target house's driveway. We all stopped, not knowing what to do. This gave us the chance to observe 4 people, 3 guys and a girl, all skinny and dressed in black, get out of the car and head to the back of the house, presumably to go into the same open door we had weeks prior. "Okay, come on," one of my friends said. I was about ready to throw in the towel at that point. Those were adults going into an abandoned house full of satanic imagery I was specifically told to stay away from. Stalking the place was all fun and games, but suddenly this was getting too hairy. I suggested we go back and get our bikes and take off. For this, I was called a pussy and the discussion was over. The next thing I knew, we were running into the tall grass of the backyard and hitting the deck. My head was now spinning as it never had before, and it suddenly became apparent that the sun had officially set. Without any plan, we just stayed on our stomachs watching the house through the grass and weeds. "Okay," one of my buddies said. "Let's go see if that door's still open." "Are you crazy?" I blurted out. "No way!" He asked why not, and I answered that there were Satanists in there, for Christ's sake. "Yeah," my other buddy returned. "We gotta see what they're up to." "No fucking way," I said plainly. "Fine," my first friend said. "Then stay here by yourself." They both began to get up, which scared the shit out of me even more than going inside, but ended up hitting the dirt again as headlights lit up the grass. Another car had pulled into the driveway. We looked at each other with wide eyes. "Shh," I cautioned. Out of the car came another 4 more people. Again, dressed all in black and carrying cages of some type. I was pretty sure there were animals in them. I then thought of the bloodstains inside the circle of candles and added up the arithmetic. Ugh, my stomach turned all the more. This time we watched as the group walked to the back basement door and entered into the house. "It's open," said one of my friends excitedly. I tensed up even more. My other buddy threw out the plan. 10 minutes, and if no one else shows up, we go in." I was now fully convinced that my friends, at least these 2, were the stupidest people on earth. And I know at this point you're probably thinking, well, you could just leave and go tell your parents what's going on. And believe me, as an adult, I think the same way. But I wasn't an adult then. I wasn't even a teen. I was a stupid kid, and being a stupid kid means never being the one who acted like a coward. So even though I had 10 minutes to talk them out of it, and I tried, there was no doing so. Their minds were made up. Once again, I was hit with, "Fine, stay here alone." And you know what? Fuck that. The time had come. We got up to our hands and knees and crawled our way through the tall grass until we hit the cracked pavement of the walkway to the staircase. Then after a brief look back and forth, we tiptoed down the steps to the door. I was shitting bricks as it creaked open at my buddy's push. There was no light from the sun at our backs like the first time we'd been there, but there was a hint of light coming from the staircase this time. I followed the leader inside and slowly and silently approached it. I felt like I had left my body, the fear was so palpable at that point. I couldn't believe what I was doing. This wasn't like spying on our older siblings as they smoked pot. This was fucking nuts. We stopped on a dime when voices from upstairs droned down to us. They were chanting some kind of ritualistic hymn together in a low tone. It was bone-chilling. Goosebumps covered my body. I wanted to turn back, but dared not to utter a word out loud. Suddenly, we were tiptoeing up the staircase to the main floor. The ambient glow from up there was flickering off the walls and my friends' bodies in front of me. One of them took a step on a creaky stair and it sounded like a freaking foghorn. At least it did to us. We froze, but the chanting kept going. Realizing this, we continued. A peek from the stairs showed the kitchen to be empty, except for those cages on the table. And so slowly and silently, in we went. The kitchen flickered with candlelight making its way in from the living room. From the angle we were at, we could poke our heads along the edge of the doorway to spy on what was going on in there. We couldn't see much, but a few of the people were visible. They were wearing black cloaks with hoods, and had their lines of vision pointed to the ground, right where the circle of candles would have been, though we couldn't see that far into the room. That chant was so creepy that I knew at that time that I'd hear it in my nightmares, that is, if I ever made it out alive. I turned back and looked at the cages on the kitchen table and could see they held some cats. Innocent little cats. That seemed to switch some of my nearly vibrating fear into anger. I had 3 cats at home. I loved them very much, and I knew it was about to happen to these ones. I don't know where I found the courage, but I suddenly found myself opening the cages to set them free. One of my buddies gave me a look like, "What the fuck are you doing?" And that's when it happened. 4 cats hopped out onto the floor, but as the 5th and final one did, he rocked the cage and it nailed the kitchen floor with a huge crash. The cats ran down the stairs towards the basement. The chanting stopped. The jig was up. "Run!" I don't remember which one of them said it. It could have even been me. It doesn't matter. We all agreed and booked it down those stairs at the speed of light, scattering out the back door behind the cats who disappeared into the darkness. At this point, my memory gets a little bit hazy. I think I may have kind of blacked out due to the fear and adrenaline coursing through my body. I do remember hearing people crash down the stairs behind us as we bolted into the backyard though, and I remember burning it down the road towards our bikes, but it's all scattered recollections. One thing that I'll never forget is that when we got on our bikes, I looked back down the street to see a few of them standing out in front of the house watching us from the street. They didn't give chase, only stared. I looked right into the eyes of one of them in particular. They were as dark as his cape. I shudder at the thought, every time I think of it, which is rare, but not never. Anyway, we rode like the wind out of there until we got to my front door, wheezing and coughing from the energy we'd expended. I told my mom what we'd seen and she lost her shit. The police were called, but the people at that house were long gone by then and never identified. That house was demolished very soon after that, probably within a month or 2. I'm sure that was both the bravest and stupidest thing I've ever done in my lifetime. I could still hum that chant we heard to this day. It and the look on that guy's face will always haunt me. But you know what? I saved those cats, so in my books, I guess it was kind of worth it. My family made a cross-country move from Detroit to Portland when I graduated from grade 7. This meant I wouldn't be going to junior high with all my best friends that I'd grown up with. Instead, I'd be starting out in a new school, in a new neighborhood, in a new city, in a new state, where I'd be the new kid and knew nobody at all. I was as upset as someone could be over this. The house we moved into was huge, but very old. It had a creepy vibe that me and my mom couldn't stand, despite the grand size. My dad kept saying it was great, especially for the price. But since it was his work that brought us out there, we just thought it was him trying to make the best of a crummy situation. There's no doubt he felt the vibe of that place too. The first few nights were blistering hot, so I was tossing and turning, and to add to that, the house made a ton of noise at night. There was creaks and cracks all over the place. It felt like the house was a living entity, stretching its muscles out from dusk till dawn in preparation to attack. And as the days went on, things got even weirder. It was as if the house was swallowing my things. I would swear I left something somewhere, like some change or a t-shirt on a shelf or something, and the next day it would be gone, like nowhere to be found in the entire house. Something was just not right. Then one night as I was drifting into sleep in my bed, I swore I heard someone walking on the roof. I forced my dad outside to take a look, but he said that there was no one there. He told me it was just house noises that would take a little getting used to. Well, even if that were the case, it scared me enough not to sleep that night, and every night after that for that matter. Around that same time of night, I'd always hear those same types of noises, and I'd swear that there were people on the roof, and if not real people, the ghosts of people. Those weren't normal house sounds, I was convinced. Now, one plus that summer was that I did make a friend. There was a girl next door named Sarah, a couple years older than me, that was really nice and welcoming. We're still friends to this day, actually. Sarah's best friend Rachel used to live in our house before we moved in, and she told me a terrifying story about her and her family and why they moved away. Rachel had dated a guy for a few months pretty heavily, but eventually lost her feelings for him. Well, this guy didn't take the breakup too well. The family, and Rachel in particular, began getting threatening notes and phone calls. They knew it was him, but couldn't prove it enough to the police for them to do anything about it. Then Rachel was attacked after a late-night pep rally. Once again, even though she didn't see her attacker, they knew it was the ex-boyfriend. Meanwhile, he hadn't been seen at school for a couple weeks before it happened. The cops went to talk to his parents and found out he hadn't been home in weeks either, so he became the main suspect in the attack. And the threatening notes kept coming. Then a break-in. Nothing was taken, but Rachel's room was trashed. A week after that, she was violently attacked again, and was only saved when headlights were seen in the distance and her attacker ran for it. Break-ins, attacks, notes, threatening calls. The pattern went on for months, but no one could find her ex-boyfriend. The dad actually ended up buying a gun at one point, but it was stolen not long after. Finally, Rachel's dad decided he was going to pack up and move before Rachel ended up dead. Even Sarah wasn't allowed to know where they were going, and she hadn't heard from her old best friend since. The deal my dad got on the house suddenly made sense. One night that summer during a sleepover, the sounds on the roof started up again. I was sleeping for once when it happened. Sarah sat up in her sleeping bag and shook me awake, though. I looked over and asked what was up. Sarah whispered, "Do you hear that?" So I listened and answered, "Yes, I hear that all the time. I'm convinced this place is haunted. I've made my dad check the roof a few times and there's never anyone up there." "That's not the roof," Sarah said in a panic. "That's coming from the attic." My heart sank. The attic? Sarah explained that when Rachel lived in our house, before she broke up with her crazy ex-boyfriend, they would hide him in the attic until everyone went to bed, and then she'd sneak him down into her room. Sarah grabbed onto my arm and looked me dead in the eyes. "There's only one way into the attic in this house, and it's through your closet." Just when I thought I couldn't panic anymore. "He's up there. I'll bet you anything, and I'll bet you even more that he's armed." I didn't know what to do. And then Sarah stood up and in a usual volume said calmly, "Can you turn the light on? I just have to go pee." Perplexed, I did what she said and watched her walk to my bedroom door and leave my room. Sitting in the silence was nerve-wracking, and then terror struck me as the footsteps above began again and stopped right over me. My heart was pounding in my chest. A few seconds later, and my bedroom door creaked open and my dad stood in the doorway signaling to come. I tiptoed over and out into the hallway with him, where Sarah and my mom also were. My dad pointed to the stairs and we all shuffled down as quiet as possible. In the distance, I heard sirens. My dad whispered for all of us to put on our shoes. As the sirens got closer, we all looked up as we heard running coming from the attic. We heard a crash and the running stopped. I'd never been so scared in my life. And suddenly my mom screamed and pointed outside at a guy hopping off the roof of our garage and taking off into the night. Seconds later, the cops pulled into our driveway. My dad yelled and pointed in the direction that he had run. The cop got back in his car and flew out of our driveway and down the road. About 2 blocks away, they caught him. For my own privacy, I won't mention his name, because then anyone could find out where I live. But for the record, they arrested him and he did have the gun on him that was stolen from Rachel's father's safe. He'd been living in our attic for the whole time we'd been there. The police found buckets of excrement up there too. He'd been taking our things, eating our food, and watching us like a true psychopath. He confessed to everything, to all of the attacks, threats, and thefts of Rachel, everything. Needless to say, he'll be in jail for a very, very long time. I bet I spent half my childhood in trees. I was a climber. My best friend Zach and I both. When I think about it now as an adult, I cringe at the thought of how high we would go in some of those trees. There was this one evergreen in particular in our neighborhood that went higher than any other building as far as the eye could see in our town. It took about 5 minutes to climb it, and when you got to the top, there were a few places to sit and take in that amazing view. We'd spend hours up there, away from everyone and everything, talking, laughing, sometimes just sitting there and thinking. It was fantastic. One summer evening, we were up there when the sun was setting over the horizon, which was a beautiful sight. But also your warning to start making your way down, because when darkness hit, that tree would sometimes become a haunt for local raccoons, and you didn't want to run into one of those 200 feet in the air. So we started to descend when Zach said stop. "Did you hear that?" he asked me. I listened and couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary, so I said no and asked what he heard. He was already climbing back to the perches at the top, so I followed and sat on my branch and joined Zach in scanning below. "A window breaking," he finally answered. From up there you could see a bird's eye view of our town and several neighboring ones. The neighborhoods closest were obviously the easiest to pick out details, so we looked down several streets until one of us saw. "There," I said, pointing to a house 2 streets over. Zach followed where I was pointing, and we both watched as a man on a second-floor sun deck was crawling into a broken window in the back of a house. The yards in these neighborhoods were all bordered by tall hedges and fences, and in this one's case, you can be sure no neighbors could see what went on in that yard unless they were invited in. We, on the other hand, had pretty much a perfect view, so we watched as this man slipped into this window he'd broken into to see what the hell was going on. We figured we were witnessing a robbery, but it turned out to be much worse than that. About half a minute after the guy went into the house, the back door flew open and another man flew out as if he'd been thrown like a rag doll onto that same sun deck. The original man we saw break in came out after and began bashing him with a baseball bat. It was gruesome. We gasped at the sight, and I remember my stomach turning. I can still see the maniacal look on his face while he beat that man. I guess some neighbors must have heard what was going on, or maybe the man that was getting hit had the chance to call the cops before the burglar got inside, because 10 blocks or so northeast of that house we saw police cars, 2 of them, speeding towards our neighborhood. We kept darting our heads back and forth between the beating and the cops. Finally, the man with the bat could hear the sirens and he ran into the house again. A few seconds later, he appeared in front of the house and hopped into a car and took off. Now we were watching him zigzag down streets while watching the cops getting closer and closer to that house, where the bloody body of that man was lying motionless on the sun deck. Eventually the man in the car pulled into a driveway, parked, and then ran into the house attached, probably about 6 or 7 blocks away in a known low-income housing complex, just as the cops pulled into the driveway of the crime scene. The officers went to the front door, disappearing from our view, as another police car way up the road started to make its way there, obviously to back him up. Meanwhile, the attacker came back outside of the house he had entered and hopped back into his car. Pulling out, he sped out of the complex and made his way south down a main road. Over at the original house, the police officers from both cars were now in the backyard looking around. Maybe they heard a groan or saw some blood dripping down or something like that, because all of a sudden they ran up the stairs to the sun deck and found the beaten man laying there. One officer knelt down while the other ran into the house. Within seconds we saw the fire hall active about 15 blocks east of us as a fire truck pulled out with its lights on. Likewise, 6 or 7 blocks southwest we saw an ambulance with its lights on pull a U-turn. We knew where they were both headed. So now our heads are turning in 4 directions. At the getaway car racing down the street to the south, the house where the victim and the police were, and the streets where the ambulance and fire engine were on. As usual, the first responders in the fire truck arrived at the scene first, followed by the ambulance no more than 2 minutes later. At around that point, the sun now down, we were just able to make out the getaway car parking down by the river, just under the main bridge out of town. He was at some distance, but we saw him flee the car and head down towards the industrial area about a mile south of where he abandoned the car. We lost sight of him due to the darkness after that. "We have to go down there," I told Zach as we watched the paramedics load the man onto a stretcher. He agreed and we began making our ways down. As luck would have it, another police car was passing by when we reached the ground, so we ran out into the road and started yelling at the rear of it as it headed down towards the street the crime scene house was on. Unluckily, they didn't notice us, but my dad did. He asked what the hell we were yelling at as I ran past him to grab my dirt bike. Zach stopped to explain what was up as I whizzed out of my driveway. No more than a minute later, I was at the house. 4 police cars were now there with their lights on. The ambulance was gone, but looky-loos were standing in every front lawn on the block. Flagging an officer, I pointed at the tall tree and described all that we'd seen. After I was done, he hopped in his car and pulled off down the road. Another 2 cops jumped in their car and followed. I was then taken home by a 4th officer, who told me to guide him, his squad car following my dirt bike, in order to take official statements from Zach and me. As we were giving them, my father listened in amazement. Not only that, but 2 transmissions came through on this officer's radio. The first reported finding the abandoned car, which was stolen from the victim he had beaten with the bat, and the second reported having a suspect in custody. The officer, who turned out to be a police captain and a very nice man, took us in the back of his car to the police station, where we identified that it was in fact the man that we had seen commit the crime, even though he was wearing different clothes by then. but it was his face, now up close. The officers had found him at a pub down by the bridge, and had identified him first by his demeanor when they entered inside, and next by the bloodstains on his shoes. We later found out that he'd gone home to change his clothes at that complex we saw him pull into, but wore the same shoes stupidly when he left. The local papers did a huge series of write-ups on the situation. In short, the attacker had been good friends with the man he attacked until he found out he was having an affair with his wife, and then decided to take his anger out on him in one of the worst ways possible. The man who was attacked had spinal injuries and brain damage, but he lived, just barely. The attacker spent the next 6 years of his life behind bars. Too short of a time, if you ask me. Me and Zach got our pictures in the paper and were heralded as heroes for helping to solve the crime. The ironic part is that we weren't even allowed to climb that tree. Our parents strictly forbid it, saying that it was too dangerous. Be that as it may, they both had those newspaper clippings on our refrigerators for years after. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of another broadcast safely and soundly. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. Don't forget to like this video, share it where you can, comment below, and subscribe to the channel for all the different content we have on the way for you. Once again, this broadcast was brought to you by cardanapparel.com. The link is in the description. Come back soon and often, my friends. Until then, stay safe.